Hi, Qian. Thank you very much for joining me for this conversation for our At Home Around the World series. I was very keen to have this conversation with you because I'm hoping to develop this into a mini-series of conversations with PRC lawyers on Chinese perspectives on international arbitration. And in particular, I thought you'd bring a different perspective from other Chinese arbitration practitioners that I might speak to, because you've obviously had the advantage of spending time at the SIAC as a counsel for the SIAC, looking at Chinese arbitration, but from the perspective of an international arbitration institution. And I thought you'd be able to bring the perspective of Chinese arbitration, not looking out from China at international arbitration, but looking back into China and how Chinese parties deal with international arbitration. Before we get into that, you've had interest in international arbitration even before joining the SIAC. And I wanted to find out, what led you to pursuing international arbitration as part of your career?
Thank you, Stephen, for having me today. I hope our chat today could be useful. So I did my law schools in China and in Europe, and my interest in arbitration developed, as early as my school days in China. So at that time, I represented our law school to participate in William C. Wismut. I believe every arbitration practitioner knows this. So during the preparation and also the oral arguments of the moot, I kind of felt the charm of arbitration, which is international, of course, and effective thanks to its transnational enforcement. After my study in China, I moved to Geneva for the specialized program on international dispute settlement. We were required to read a lot of writings and also awards. And I still remember that one day when I just moved to Geneva, I was reading this awards from SGS versus Pakistan and SGS versus Philippines, in which cases the counsel argued the umbrella clause. So I was totally amazed. I feel like international arbitration was in the process of developing, and you can, as a creative lawyer, raise these interesting arguments and, contribute to the development of international arbitration. After my study at the MITS, but at that time I decided to stay in Europe for some while because I knew that international arbitration was not that well developed in China 7 years ago. So I stayed in Europe and I worked with some of the very good arbitration lawyers there. Then I went back to Beijing, worked in a Chinese law firm focused on litigation and arbitration. And then in 2016, I came to Singapore because, I always think Singapore is leading arbitral seat, is arbitration-friendly legislation and very good arbitration practice environment. People in Europe say that, Paris is home of international arbitration. I think Singapore is the home of international arbitration, at least, for in the Asian Pacific region. So I stayed since then. And of course, working at SIC is a huge privilege. I got the opportunity to see and, help many cases, opportunities to work with very good arbitrators, of course, including you, Stephen. So for me, it's a learning experience. So I will continue working in this way, and hopefully I could contribute a bit.
Well, I'm sure you will, Chen. You've really built up, quite an impressive CV in international arbitration. Studying at MITS, working in Europe, working in China, and now at the SIAC. This brings us probably to a good point to ask you about your perspective on Chinese parties with international arbitration, particularly from your perspective as an SIAC counsel. You would have seen a lot of cases now involving Chinese parties at the SIAC. What particularities do you see when you have a Chinese party involved in international arbitration that you'd like to comment on?
There are quite a number of Chinese parties in SIC arbitrations. The first one I would like to mention is the stereotypical critical view on dispute. If you go to see our historical cases, you will see that the Chinese parties appeared as respondents in most of the the relevant cases. But from recent years, in particular the recent 5 years, we see more and more Chinese parties acting as claimant, which means that they actively commence arbitration against the other party at SIC. So I think this reflects a change of mindset of Chinese parties. I do understand that Chinese typically regard dispute as bad thing. We want to avoid that, and this kind of view influenced our strategy when we have the dispute. But nowadays, I think people's views are changing, and also the education of arbitration is working too. The Chinese people are aware that international arbitration is a very good way for them to pursue their claims against a foreign party, and the enforcement of the award is easier. I'm sure Stephen, you're a very experienced counsel and also arbitrator. You've also seen many of these kind of cases. Do you share the same views on this change of mindset?
I'm not sure about change of mindset. I definitely think that there's been a change or a development in the appreciation and understanding of international arbitration in China. I've been traveling to China for quite a few years now, interacting with Chinese practitioners. And I've noticed how the level of understanding of arbitration in China has certainly increased. I mean, there was one case that comes to mind, actually, reacting to what you said. One is, I sat as an arbitrator on a panel back in, I think, 2017. And that was a case in which a Chinese party had commenced the arbitration. So it picks up on your point that you see more Chinese parties now resorting to arbitration to enforce the legal right. But what struck me about that case was that Chinese party submitted one of the first applications under the SIAC 2016 rules for early dismissal. And that shows an understanding and sophistication of the rules. So I think when you mentioned that when you were studying in China, arbitration was not that developed, it may have been so, but I think certainly today when I look at the arbitration practitioners that I talk to, I mean, many of them are highly sophisticated and completely au fait with all of the latest thinking on international arbitration. So that's been my observation about arbitration in China. Let's come back and talk about some of the particularities of arbitration involving Chinese parties. You've mentioned this to me, and I've seen this myself, how sometimes arbitration clauses involving Chinese parties will make reference to some arbitration commission or some derivative of an arbitration clause that might have been used in China. Can you tell me something about these clauses that you've seen at SIAC, and how have these been addressed?
Sure. So we know that in China, there's a very famous arbitration institution. Its name is CAAI. In mainland China, we have so many arbitration commissions in different cities. So it came to our attention that it happens sometime that we receive arbitration clauses providing arbitration at CTAC with a capital S, not C, or arbitration at Singapore Arbitration Commission. I know immediately that this is a nice compromise between the Chinese party and the other party, because they took it for granted that in Singapore there's a kind of counterpart of CTAC. Not uncommon to see arbitration clauses providing non-existent arbitral institution, but for this specific agreement on CTAC with S or Singapore Arbitration Commission, it almost inevitably invites a jurisdictional challenge either before the constitution of the tribunal or after the constitution of the tribunal. So for some of the cases, I've seen the non-happy party would say, see, hey, this clause is invalid and it doesn't work. There's no basis to commence arbitration at SIC. And they will probably raise Rule 28.1 objection and ask the SIC Court of Arbitration to determine, if SIC is competent to administer this case. Or, in some of the cases, after the constitution of the tribunal, the party will raise this to the tribunal. One recent concluded case where, the arbitrator was facing this issue, and the unhappy Chinese respondents saying that it's invalid and the tribunal has no jurisdiction. And the Chinese party simply commenced the litigation before the Chinese court and asked the Chinese court to decide on the validity of the arbitration clause. And on the other hand, the SIC arbitration was still proceeding, and the arbitrator, of course, saying that, by virtue of competence, I am the one who is going to decide on the jurisdiction. And the tribunal actually ordered the Chinese party to stop litigation before the Chinese court. Dangers of parallel proceedings when facing such clauses.
Well, without talking too much about and disclosing too much about the particulars of any case, which you obviously have to keep confidential, when faced with the clause which says arbitration before CTAC with an S, or with the clause which refers to arbitration before the Singapore Arbitration Commission, what would the SIAC do if there's a dispute as to jurisdiction prior to constitution of the tribunal? Does the SIAC accept these cases?
At the stage of commencement of arbitrations, we generally accept those applications. But you must be familiar with our rules, which states that before the constitution of the tribunal, if one party considers that this proceeding should not be conducted under the SIC rules, or SIC has no competence, they can request the registrar of the SIC to refer the case to the SIC Court of Arbitration, who is going to decide whether it is prima facie satisfied that the arbitration shall proceed. So at that stage, the threshold is very low, but this does not mean that it cannot succeed before the tribunal.
It's interesting to hear that the SIC applies a relatively low threshold, and it's more likely to accept these clauses than not, and of course then let the tribunal decide. I want to take this opportunity to discuss with you, Qian, another aspect of arbitrations involving Chinese parties, which is probably a bit more peculiar to Chinese parties, which is the question of language. I think most arbitrations in this part of the world, we probably assume that it is conducted in English. But where you do have Chinese parties, I do know that sometimes the arbitration is conducted entirely in Chinese. And sometimes you've got bilingual arbitration. I mean, I myself have been asked a few times whether I can sit in either a Chinese language arbitration or a bilingual arbitration. What's your experience with this question of language involving Chinese parties in arbitration?
Top choice of language is definitely Chinese. And I see nowadays, the Chinese parties as well as Chinese lawyers, we are trying to promote the use of Chinese as a language of arbitration. And at SIC, in previous years, we did handle arbitration proceedings conducted entirely in Chinese. So when there's such an agreement that the arbitration proceeding should be in Chinese, all our communications and letters, as well as the oral arguments are conducted before the tribunal, was in Chinese, and there's no problem with that. We're capable of doing that. But there's a more problematic scenario where the parties have no agreement on the language of the proceeding, yet the proceeding involves one Chinese party. If the Chinese party is the claimant, they tried to argue that Chinese should be the language of the proceeding, and they will give their reasons. But even before the constitution of the tribunal, as counsel, I will treat this cautiously because I don't want to cause any irregularity in informing the parties of the proceedings. So I will send out the communications in Chinese and English. And after the constitution of the tribunal, this issue will be determined by the tribunal. Because under the SIC rules, the language is an issue to be determined by the tribunal.
What particular aspects of bilingual arbitration do you think a party needs to take care of? Let's take a hypothetical example. I mean, one of the problems might be appointment of arbitrators. If there's a bilingual arbitration, what happens if a party appoints an arbitrator that isn't fully conversant, say in Mandarin? How would that be dealt with?
In a very unfortunate hypothetical scenario you mentioned, if it is SIC arbitration and if that is the party's choice as a co-arbitrator, I think it's highly likely that the appointing authority will respect that. But if the three-member tribunal and the presiding arbitrator who is going to be appointed by the institution, I think the appointing authority will take into consideration of the language requirement and also the co-arbitrator appointed or nominated by the party who could not speak Chinese, and probably appoint someone who is proficient in both languages. If none of the arbitrators appointed by the parties could speak Mandarin or another language required by the parties, I think the parties need to discuss the language issue seriously with the tribunal, because on one hand, the parties' agreement on language, and the parties' agreement is the cornerstone of arbitration. On the other hand, the decision makers, who are the most important people, during the proceeding, cannot speak, one of the languages. And I've seen cases where the tribunal discussed with the party, and they said that, okay, let's have English as the prevailing language, for the main submissions as well as the oral arguments. And the tribunal may also order at the same time, also, in compliance with the agreement, that the main submissions, like statement of claim, statement of defense, and counterclaim, if any, and post-hearing briefs, etc., be submitted also in Chinese. There are ways to conduct such proceedings, and not to harm the integrity of the arbitration agreement.
So, if someone should ask you, having had all this experience that you've had looking at the question of language and arbitration, if someone were to ask you whether it would be advisable to have a bilingual arbitration, what would your answer be?
My answer will be no. I don't think it's a effective way, but this is just my personal opinion. I mean, for the institution, you're Chinese, English, or other language, or bilingual, we're happy to help, and we're ready to help. But for me, yeah, it's not desired. You will see that parties spending a lot of time preparing, submissions in both languages, and those submissions in bilingual might born issues because of the inconsistencies conveyed by different languages. And this also reminds me of the old story of the Tower of Babel. Actually, one thing I learned from the story is that if you want to complete one project, a uniform language would be most helpful, because people can understand each other quickly and easily. But in the case that both languages need to be used, be careful of the submissions and of the translations that might be involved. Bilingual proceeding is generally not desired because it may create more problems than convenience.
Right. Thank you very much, Qian. I think that's a good point for us to close this conversation with your exhortations on whether a party should have a bilingual arbitration or not. Thank you very much for joining me for this. It's been a very, very interesting conversation, and I look forward to the time when we can freely meet in Maxwell Chambers again. It's not quite the case yet, but hopefully that will be something that we will be able to do soon.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I hope to see you soon too. Bye-bye.